Had a really interesting question posted in the comments of a previous video asking about breathing when swimming. Now in this video, I'm not going to cover things like technique side of things and that. There's plenty of other resources, and I'll list a few in a moment. But what we're going to be talking about is the physiology of breathing in terms of the swimming side of things and how it relates to swimming, how we can maximize that, and a couple of little tips to be able to practice it and ultimately get better to maximize our swimming performance. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, making sports science simple. In today's video, we're talking about really the physiology behind making our breathing, particularly when we're swimming, as effective and as efficient as possible, so that ultimately we can improve our performance, because it is a really critical part. The obvious thing we need to consider when we're talking about something like swimming is we're under the water. So we can't get oxygen in when our head is under the water compared to when we might be on the bike or out running, particularly for triathletes. This is probably relevant for, and those amateur triathletes out there who aren't from swimming backgrounds or getting into triathlon, but now they need to do swimming for the first time, might not be comfortable swimmers. You might get a bit stressed out in open water and struggle that way. These little tips that you can pick up here are hopefully going to be quite useful to be able to unlocking a little bit of extra potential and actually going a long way to improving your swimming. And really what it stems all down from is, first and foremost, how relaxed are you in the water? If you're really tense and a bit stressed out, don't like having your head underwater, or haven't learned proper breath regulation, it can be really difficult and really impactful on your performance. We all know, particularly if you're running or cycling, if you start to tense up, get a bit tight, things start to go down in terms of performance-wise. We start to get a little bit slower. We start to fatigue a bit quicker and feel the effects of fatigue. It can be a bit stressful psychologically, so that might impact performance. Same goes for in the water, and it's probably even more exaggerated, particularly if you're not overly comfortable. And learning how to regulate your breath can be a really effective way to help that relaxation. Obviously, there's a lot of research out there around mindfulness techniques and using breath regulation for relaxation purposes, but it's super, super critical when you're in a different or a foreign environment, if you like, in terms of water, where if you don't regulate your breath well, you're going to be in all sorts of issues. Because like I said before, when your head's underwater, you can't get oxygen in. There's nothing we can do there. We need to be able to work out ways that we can regulate our breath so that when we do have opportunities to breathe, we get maximal bang for buck. So very, very quickly on the physiology of breathing, and really then how it relates to swimming, is that ultimately we're just exchanging gases. Really, really basic, simple level. And I'm skipping over some of the extra parts here, but it's oxygen comes in, CO2 or carbon dioxide goes out. That's really what we're trying to achieve. We like oxygen. We need that in the body to come through, work through all the way down into the muscles, break down fuel, create aerobic energy. Great. We want to get CO2 out because CO2 is partly acidic. That's a byproduct of our processes. Body doesn't like CO2. We can't use the oxygen out of it. So we need to breathe that back out. Really simple exchange process that goes on. And that's happening in the lungs effectively. So we get oxygen in, we take a big breath in, air total. So there is a bit of nitrogen, hydrogen, a bunch of other stuff, but primarily oxygen is what we need out of that air. That comes into the lungs. CO2 is going to go out because everything works on what we call a pressure gradient. So gases as a whole, and this is what we're talking about, oxygen and carbon dioxide are in gas form. In terms of what we're looking at here is gases move from relatively high concentration to low concentration. So if you like to think about in terms of the room I'm in here, if we pumped this up with full of oxygen, it was 100% oxygen, if I opened a window, that would all flow straight out the window as quickly as possible, because outside at sea level is only about 21% oxygen. So we have high concentration in here, relatively low concentration outside. Vice versa, outside, there's a lot more hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. As soon as I open that window, that's going to flow in the other direction. So they're going to exchange from high to low concentration. And that's basically what's happening in the lungs. In our lungs, we have relatively high concentration of CO2. Outside, relatively higher concentration of oxygen. So when we take that breath in, those gases exchange, and that's how we get the oxygen into our system. The greater that differential is, or the greater that gradient, so if we have a really high, if you try and hold your breath, and let's say you take 10 strokes in the pool and you're holding your breath, a lot of CO2 build up as a result. What does that mean? As soon as we go to take that breath, well, those gases are probably going to exchange a lot quicker because we want to get the oxygen as best we can. So you take that breath, pending then how stressed out that breath is going to determine how much is actually going to come in as well. But already we're getting this good exchange. So if we can regulate how much, when our oxygen comes in and when our CO2 goes out, it's going to go a long way to making sure that that pressure gradient or that exchange of gases in the lungs is going to be as effective, as efficient as possible. And fundamentally, when we're swimming, we can't get oxygen in when our head is down under the water. But what we can do is we can expel the CO2, because we don't really care where that goes, do we? Like when it's in our lungs, we just need to get CO2 out. We don't care if it ends up in the water or if it ends up in the atmosphere in terms of the air. So that's why you'll see, if you watch any Olympics or even the Paralympics that's on at the moment, you look at the best swimmers, you can see them clearly in the underwater shots. They're clearly expelling air out under the water. Why is that? They're trying to get rid of as much CO2 as they can. So as soon as their head turns, or once your head comes out of the water, we only have a very small window to get as much air into our system and as much oxygen into our system as possible. So expelling all that air out underneath the water, getting rid of all that CO2 in the water, as soon as our head comes up and we're able to get air in, we're starting that process straight away. And so that's what the I guess really practicing your breath regulation is all about. Is all about maximizing how much CO2 we can get out under the water, maximize how much oxygen can come in. Again, we're manipulating that pressure gradient, trying to get as much exchange out of it as possible. So there's a little bit of insight in terms of like the physiology behind it. And like I said, largely this is going to come down to how relaxed you are. So a couple of little tips you might want to use to practice some of these techniques is, it does look a little bit silly. And like I mentioned right at the beginning, this is the type of stuff that I was teaching or have taught before to little kids who are first learning to swim, like your 3 and 4 year olds. But I taught it all the way up to teenagers, and even had at the end of my swim teaching days, was teaching some adults who are learning to swim this stuff as well, because it does suit all ages and abilities. And we're really trying to just improve how relaxed we are on the water. Stand at the end of the lane. When you jump in, if you feel a little bit stressed and want to work on some of this, just stand at the end of the lane, get nice and low to the water, so you're not obviously standing up and bending all the way over, depending on how deep it is. But what you want to do is just take a couple of deep, relaxing breaths in. So it might be 3 or 4 seconds in, 3 or 4 seconds out. Slow your breathing down, just get nice and comfortable, get settled into the temperature of the water as well. So relax yourself a little bit, maybe do a couple laps, then stop at the end of the lane, few deep breaths in and out, and then take a nice deep breath in, drop down under the water, or you might just put your face in the water, whatever you like, and just really, with a decent amount of force, but you don't have to be blasting it out, but just calmly just breathe out as much of that CO2 as you can. And once you feel like it's all out, come back up, take that deep breath back in, back down. Repeat that process sort of 4 or 5 times, have a bit of a break, might want to repeat it again. But doing that, just small little exercise at the beginning of each of your swimming sessions, can really help to, one, just settle you, relax you down, get you ready for that swimming set, but also just get that process working in terms of that breath regulation and help teach you to regulate your breath a bit better. What I'd also then encourage you to do is just over time, you don't have to extend this out to long periods. Obviously be mindful of how long you are under the water for, but maybe extend it out instead of 3 or 4 seconds breathing in and out. So breathe in for 3 seconds, expel it out for 3 seconds underwater, build that out to 5 and then 6, and maybe up to sort of 10 seconds if you can, probably no more than that. You don't need to do more than that. That's just going to help progress. All right, how effective am I at sort of getting all that air out underwater and really controlling it? You want to be controlling it so that as soon as you feel like you need a breath, you've blown everything out, you come back up. And really that's kind of then replicating what we're going to do when we're in our stroke and we're swimming as well, isn't it? It's, I get as much out as I can in the time I need to. So as soon as my head turns, I'm ready to take that breath in. I'm not trying to then breathe out extra air and take that. You see swimmers who struggle a little bit, who aren't great at regulating their breath, they'll turn their head to breathe, and it's almost they're breathing out and then in. So they're wasting all that time above the water, more than anything, wasting the time below the water. When they come up, they're also wasting the time above the water because they're breathing out first to get air back in. So they're taking like a half breath, and it's this like really quick out in sort of a pattern, which really then ultimately tenses everything up too. What we want to do is just come up, maybe a little bit out, breathe out, just to clear some water across our face. We don't want to be obviously taking on water as we lift our head up, but then majority of that time above the water is going to be spent getting air in and getting that good gaseous exchange happening, getting that oxygen sucking into the lungs as best we can. So there's a little tip you can practice. The other thing I'd probably recommend as well is work on your swimming technique. Go and seek out a swimming-based coach, or even if you're having a look online, I'm going to give a bit of a shout out to the guys at Effortless Swimming. They do a fantastic job of putting up some swimming drills and technique advice. They're unbelievable in terms of their swimming clinics when they do have them. Working on your technique to be able to improve your breathing, you're at what we call your breathing position in the water. So how effectively you actually position yourself. That's going to go a long way to giving you maximal time to take that breath, but also not reducing the speed. There's a bit of a trade-off between, well, if I turn my head, and you see slower swimmers tend to do this, and beginner swimmers turn their head as far as they can. They're almost looking up to the roof when they're doing a freestyle stroke. That comes from poor breath regulation because they feel they need more time to get their air in, but also it tends to show up signs of like their arm dropping at the front. So They don't have as much, I guess, stability through the water. So they use their whole body to manipulate that. We end up getting a lot of this rocking action in a much slower form. You look at the really good swimmers, their head's nice and low, looking across the top of the surface, minimal time to get their breath in, comparative, but they don't need to because they keep that momentum in the stroke up and they're really good at regulating their breath as well. So there's a couple of factors there. So I definitely encourage working on the technique side of things. That's going to go a long way, but practicing some of these breath regulation techniques is going to help you keep you nice and relaxed and maximize the physiology behind your breathing as well. So hopefully you got a little bit out of this, particularly for those who aren't great swimmers or coming into swimming or coming into triathlon. Now they have to be a swimmer as well. Hopefully some of these tips might help you. I know it is very, very back to basics, but it's a really, really critical skill that I can't recommend highly enough to go and practice. But like I said, hopefully you got something out of it. Let me know in the comments down below. Do you practice some of these skills, or have you even thought about breath regulation when it comes to improving your swimming performance before? Let me know. Always happy to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Keep the questions coming through as well. Great question that stemmed the idea for this video as well. I'm going to leave it there for today. Hopefully you enjoy this one, and we'll see you in the next one.